Well, would you credit it? Boris Johnson acted unlawfully in proroguing Parliament and dragged Her Majesty the Queen into illegality. So is it off to the Tower with the Prime Minister? No, it's off to Parliament to demand an election, but the opposition won't give him one until he rules out a no-deal Brexit. What on earth will happen next? If anyone knows, it's our top panel of political pundits. Join Peter Oborne, Lembit, Opik and Ruth Wishart from Scotland on the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we once again ask our team of top commentators to attempt the impossible, to forecast what's next for Brexit. Over the summer, they've performed near miracles in anticipating both the controversial proroguing of Parliament, the legislative response from the Commons, and the Prime Minister's attempt to dash to the polls.
How do you stop a government determined to go out with a no deal if that's what happens? But are they theoretically united to stop the proroguing of Parliament and to stop no deal? Yes, and I think the sense of that will intensify over the coming weeks rather than the opposite.
However, even Mystic Meg would have been hard put to foresee that Supreme Court deliberations would be the talk of the steaming as the top justices decided whether to back the Scottish courts and a former Tory Prime Minister in declaring the current Tory Prime Minister's actions unlawful. The judgment, when it came, was unanimous and devastating.
The court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful. The prorogation was also void and of no effect. Parliament has not been prorogued. This is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices. It is for Parliament, and in particular the Speaker and the Lord Speaker, to decide what to do next.
To consider these remarkable events, Alex turns back to our panel of commentators. In the blue corner, we have Peter Oborne. Nobody knows more than this man about the inner workings of the Conservative Party.
Now he's in number 10. He's seeing the warnings from the civil service about the calamity of no deal. It's an absolute nightmare. Mr. Johnson knows that. I've had reports. I've spoken to senior civil servants. I mean, Gove goes white with fear now. They know that if they go for no deal, it's going to cause utter chaos.
And in the yellow corner, we turn to former Liberal presidential candidate Lembit Opik. Have his old mates finally found the formula to shake off the Tory coalition blues?
My frustration is there was a referendum and nobody said, oh, well, best of three. And we're heading down that path. Lib Dems, in fairness, totally consistent, have been for 3 years. They've actually become more militant in their Remain. They want to now say, if Jo Swinson becomes Prime Minister, she probably won't, but if she did, they wouldn't even have a referendum. They'd simply junk Remain. So there's somewhere for Remainers to go. But I just don't think that fits comfortably with those of us who thought we had one referendum and Democrats and Liberals would respect the outcome.
And we take the temperature from north of the border, from national columnist and broadcaster Ruth Wishart. The courts brought the Scottish dimension to Brexit back to the centre stage by ruling in favour of the case against prorogation led by SNP MP Joanna Cherry QC. Are Scottish politics going to be the real story of this epic autumn?
Brexit isn't just damaging to the UK as a whole. Brexit is damaging to Scotland. There have been all kinds of calculations done about the job losses likely in Scotland. The last calculation, I think, was 100,000 jobs lost. So I think the Scottish Government has taken the view that in the short term, at least, stopping Brexit, or at least stopping a no-deal Brexit, has to take priority.
But first, your tweets, messages and emails in response to last week's show, where Alex interviewed Michael O'Sullivan, the author of The Levelling. Robert says, we can't wait that long. Now, this is in response to Michael's suggestion that Scottish independence will come within the next 5 to 10 years. Robert says, Westminster now resembles Alice in Wonderland and it's not fit for purpose. We need out now. Liv says again in relation to Michael, fantastic guest here. I'll get the book. Louise says Professor Bosch gave a nice summary of the thinking behind the whole independence in Europe idea that we've been aware of since 1990 or so. He also pointed out the threat to self-determination and equality of a centralised empire-like United States of Europe. And finally, Jamie says, I think you should get nicer chairs for your guests. Well, Jamie, I quite like our chairs, but if you've got any suggestions for new chairs, please do send them in. Now, since our last consultation with the commentators, political drama in the UK has finally reached the surreal stage. This was the woman of the moment, Joanna Cherry, outside the Supreme Court on Tuesday.
His advice given to Her Majesty the Queen was unlawful, his position is untenable, and he should have the guts for once to do the decent thing and resign.
The government attempted a proroguing coup against Parliament and ended up facing a parliamentary coup against the government, with the Commons once again seizing control of legislation to rule out a no-deal Brexit. Boris Johnson's Svengali Dominic Cummings laid a snap election trap for the opposition, who promptly refused to walk into it, leaving the Prime Minister high and dry. When Parliament resumed early this month, he had a bare majority. Now, after a purge of the Europhiles, it is in a minority of over 40. Now Johnson has become the first ever UK Prime Minister to lead Her Majesty the Queen herself into illegality. His position as Prime Minister now hangs by a thread. However, as this week's conference has made clear, the opposition Labour Party is also still full of the woes of Brexit. In contrast, Liberals and the SNP should have a spring in their step. But can they really stop Brexit this autumn? There seems little to be done, except for the Prime Minister to buckle down and actually try and pull off a European deal if he intends to meet the hard Halloween deadline. It is either do a deal or die in the last ditch. Even for a high-wire politician like Boris Johnson, this would hardly seem the moment to risk defying the courts by ignoring parliamentary legislation. Survival itself will be difficult enough without jumping headlong into the void. All these legal pyrotechnics resulted in Parliament resuming unexpectedly yesterday, with the MP who kicked off the court proceedings leading the debate, answered by the Attorney-General, whose legal advice to Boris Johnson landed the Prime Minister in the Supreme Court soup. If anyone can tell us what happens next, it is our commentators. Alex is joined by Peter Oborne and Lembit Opik.
Now, I'm joined by our top political pundits, born-again Brexiteer Lembit Opik and born-again Remainer Peter Oborne. Hey guys, last time you were on, you did not forecast that the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, in a unanimous decision, was going to declare the Prime Minister and the Queen's actions unlawful. What on earth were you thinking of, Peter Oborne?
Well, I couldn't have predicted probably the most momentous day in modern political legal history, since something like the 1688 revolution. It's something which will be studied for centuries to come. It'll be in every legal textbook. It'll be every constitutional work. And I have to say, personally watching it, I was so emotionally affected in a way I've only once been affected in that way before, was the Lord Hutton inquiry, when Lord Hutton stood up and cleared John Scarlett, the JIC guy, Tony Blair, from anything wrong in David Kelly and the Iraq War. And I almost fell on the ground then, and I almost fell on the ground here.
Well, I agree, it's as momentous as that. It's for different reasons. I think this is as big a travesty as what happened in the Iraq Review. You're right, maybe I am a born-again Brexiteer, but this is about politics. We're being told by the courts that the Prime Minister hasn't got the right to decide when to prorogue government, even leaving aside the Brexit debate.
It's not proroguing government, though, is it, Lembit?
Sorry,
it's proroguing Parliament, and that's the key, because the courts have surely upheld parliamentary sovereignty.
Okay, you're right, but really, I just think that they've upheld a new precedent. One which says that just as we are meant to have fixed-term parliaments, and that doesn't really mean anything at all, so also the Prime Minister has to go cap in hand to Parliament to ask permission to prorogue. So to me, this is a terrible week for democracy. And after that, you can ask what else needs to go to court before the Prime Minister or the government can act.
You're so wrong. As a Liberal Democrat, you should feel ashamed of yourself for saying that, making that kind of statement. I followed every word of that, the Supreme Court debate, as it were, discussion, And what it was a discussion about what comes first, parliamentary democracy or the executive, the legislature or the executive. And Britain, it was very clear, if you listen to Lord Panick's brilliant constitutional masterclass, we are a parliamentary democracy and the legislature is in charge and the executive does what it's told.
Well, we can't see this at the moment. We'll look back at this time and observe that this was the time when the executive began to lose power. I don't know where this ends up, but it doesn't end up in a more democratic system.
Well, can I intervene as the referee? I mean, your divisions reflect the divisions in the country, perhaps. But who are the winners and the losers, Peter Oborne? Who's emerged from these court judgments as big winners and who is looking like total losers?
Well, the biggest loser is the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who advised the Queen to prorogue Parliament, and she did what she was asked. Queen Victoria was not amused, but Queen Elizabeth II will be absolutely furious. Then we come on to the matter of Mr. Johnson's cabinet. Jacob Rees-Mogg is an honourable man. He went up to Balmoral as a Privy Councillor to tell the Queen to do this. Is he going to... it's astonishing to me that he's had the audacity not to resign.
66 years on the throne, and Queen Elizabeth, Queen of Scots, Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom, now has a Prime Minister who's led her into unlawfulness.
You can't really say that Boris Johnson deliberately misled the Queen.
The Supreme Court in Scotland said exactly that. The Supreme Court of the United Kingdom said they didn't need to go into that because the judgment stood anyway.
OK, I don't think he did it on purpose, but that's a moot point. The fundamental issue for me is that there's almost no way out for Boris to escape the promise he made that we would leave on the 31st of October. He has to try to do that. And if he plays clever here, I think he could line himself up with what is definitely a junk bond risky strategy for a general election, but a strategy that could actually propel him into majority. And that's because this only works against Boris Johnson if the country is against him. My feeling is this is causing a rage amongst the Brexit community, which is far more motivating than the comfortable smugness of the Remain.
But Peter Oborne, I mean, you've been in many ways a fierce critic of Boris Johnson, but unusually, you've always believed that he actually wants to do a deal. Would this be the impetus, if he can't get an election, let's say, that the only thing left is to do a deal?
Well, Mr. Johnson has three choices at the moment. When Parliament has returned, he will can obey the orders of Parliament and go on the 19th of October, and ordered by Parliament, he will then deliver this request for an extension. That would be the ultimate humiliation. He can't do that politically, or he can refuse that request, in which case he would quit as Prime Minister. Or he will go all out for a deal. So my view that he will go all out for a deal, all the more so that because now he's in number 10, he's seeing the warnings from the civil service about the calamity of no deal. It's an absolute nightmare. Mr. Johnson knows that. I've had reports. I've spoken to senior civil servants. I mean, Gove goes white with fear now. They know that if they go for no deal, it's going to cause utter chaos.
So you're for he's going all out for a deal, but you think he'll go all out for an election. But how does he get an election when the opposition have him dangling on a high wire?
Well, on this I agree with Peter. He could get a deal, and that deal isn't defined, although Parliament has to approve it, of course. He could make a very simple, a one-page deal, theoretically fulfills that condition. Now, the election point, I think, is the big gambit here, and I feel that the opposition parties have got themselves into a mess here. The Lib Dems, who are riding high to an extent, almost level pegging with the Labour Party because they so clearly Remain. They clearly want an election. Labour Party not so keen, but Boris needs to clear the air. Boris Johnson is actually in a much stronger position than is being implied here. If you add the Brexit Party vote to the Conservative Party vote, it's in the 40s, even touching just over 50%. Now, this is difficult and unpalatable for many people in the Conservatives, but Farage has made clear that he would do a sub-deal with Boris if he doesn't do a big deal with the European Union. So actually, if we are delayed after the 31st of October, he can appeal to the country and can Jeremy Corbyn really walk away from the next opportunity for a general election, however damaging it could be for Labour? I don't think he can.
Well, lively so far. Join us after the break for some more fireworks from our political pundits. Welcome back. Let's get back into this discussion, guys. Now, the Irish have a phrase, to be greatly to blame. Who's greatly to blame in this situation? Is Dominic Cummings the #1 villain of the piece?
Well, Mr. Cummings is one of the most unappetizing figures ever to play any role in number 10 Downing Street. It was a great mistake by Boris Johnson to appoint this out-of-control bully who has behaved in an appalling way, and it has obviously given dreadful advice to the Prime Minister.
But surely, I mean, you can't blame a mere advisor for the actions of the Prime Minister. I mean, Johnson not just appointed him, he followed his advice.
Exactly. So the person who made the decision, people who are calling for Cummings to go, basically use him as an air raid shelter. It's a way of not calling for Johnson to go.
In the medieval courts, you didn't call for the removal of the monarch. You said, get rid of these bad advisors.
Yes, you could normally beheaded them as well.
You're not sort of suggesting that for poor Mr. Cummings.
Well, I got me too happier fate, as far as I'm concerned, for this man who has waged single-handed war and everything that's decent.
Come on, say a word of defence for Mr. Cummings. I want a word of defence on Dominic's behalf.
2 words, short memories. We had Peter Mandelson, we had Alistair Campbell, we had Andy Coulson. I think he went to prison.
But Peter's written about them all.
Yeah, and you know very well, Cummings hasn't actually committed a criminal offence. He may behave in a questionable way at times. But this seems to characterise senior advisers in the Prime Minister's office. And here's the other danger. You're making assumptions about how this plays out. But if I'm right and Boris Johnson gets an electoral bounce because the country on balance thinks this isn't fair, then actually Cummings could come out smelling roses.
Well, I should say that since we've listed all these dreadful special advisors, they aren't here to defend themselves. In my view, they're all estimable people and, of course, can come on this programme any time to have their say. Now, I want to look at the state of the parties in this remarkable interrupted conference season. But let's just have a word first, whatever our views on the matter, of these 2 remarkable women from north and south of the border, Joanna Cherry, the MP QC for the SNP, and of course Gina Miller, who both brought successful court cases before and have now pulled it off again. What about them?
Procedurally, they have played a blinder. Whether I like what they've done or not, they saw an opportunity, particularly up there north of the border, before it even became obvious to us, and played the cards perfectly. Now, Gina Miller followed that up. I'm still surprised by what happened, but I got to credit the fact that she knew how it worked, and she got the result.
I'd say be much more generous than you. I think that Joanna Cherry and Gina Miller have now earned themselves a footnote, each of them, in British history, looking back over the whole sweep, because they've made a massive impact on the constitutional, legal, political world we live in. They're admirable women. They're heroes. And I'd say the same also, I think, Justice Hale, Lady Hale. One of the points, what we've seen over the last 2 days is a blizzard of hatred aimed at the Supreme Court judges. They're Remainers, they're out of touch, they're metropolitan. Now, let me say, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Eton arrogant. Boris Johnson, Eton arrogant. Lady Hale, state educated, a woman, elderly, a northerner. Now, this is a real person with real experience in life, unlike these arrogant old Etonians who are ruining this country.
And once her microphone came on, real communication skills. Yeah. I want to go through...
And talks very clearly, yes.
Very clearly, very succinctly. Now, you must agree that Lady Hale has emerged as the heroine of the hour.
Yeah, but to start talking about the state or grammar or private school background simply illustrates how divided and distracted the whole debate is. Peter, who's apparently really a born-again Remainer here, loves what happened because he loves the outcome. I'm not so keen because I don't like the outcome. But objectively speaking, it's not what we think that matters, it's what the country thinks. And I think Peter's in for a rude awakening there.
But Lembit, you were once a Remainer as well. So how about your old lot, when you were a Remainer, when you were part of the Liberal Democrat firmament? I mean, they must be walking on air now, are they not?
I was a Remainer, but I'm also a Democrat, and that hasn't changed. My frustration is there was a referendum and nobody said, oh, well, best of 3. And we're heading down that path. Lib Dems, in fairness, totally consistent, have been for 3 years. They've actually become more militant in their Remain. They want to now say if Jo Swinson becomes Prime Minister, she probably won't, but if she did, they wouldn't even have a referendum. They'd simply junk Remain. So there's somewhere for Remainers to go, but I just don't think that fits comfortably with those of us who thought we had one referendum and Democrats and Liberals would respect the outcome.
Lastly, guys, you've had a great record as a panel over this summer. Didn't predict the Supreme Court, but then who did? But just about everything else you predicted. So I want a short, succinct phrase. Whether Brexit.
Yes to Brexit, probably delayed, leading to a general election, which Boris Johnson can win as long as he does a deal with Nigel Farage.
Peter?
I think that Mr. Johnson will strike a deal with Europe. And I think he will probably take Britain out on a deal which looks almost identical, or is almost identical, to the one he trashed, i.e. Mrs. May's deal.
Peter Oborne, Lembit, Opik, thank you so much. And now we turn to north of the border, and we turn to Ruth Wishart, that long-standing, outstanding columnist and broadcaster. Does she think that Scotland will emerge as the big political story this autumn? Ruth, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Ruth, tell us a bit about Joanna Cherry's emergence. I mean, this is the second major court victory that she has won over the UK government in the most dramatic terms. What is behind this emergence of this formidable woman?
Well, of course, she is in her own right a formidable lawyer, even though when she's sitting in the House of Commons as a Scottish MP, Theresa May never used to call her right honourable and learned friend, as is the custom, but she is, in fact, a very learned friend, and she's done an absolutely cracking job. She's a very good performer, she's very articulate, she's very determined, and you take her on at your peril.
I was very interested where she came out of the Supreme Court on Tuesday, immediately moved the spotlight on to Boris Johnson's continuation as Prime Minister, or not, as the case may be, moving from the legal side to the political with no intervening step whatsoever. That was pretty impressive.
It was, and it's also very pertinent because here in Scotland, the arrival of Boris Johnson in Number 10 has meant that the case for independence has gathered some momentum, and indeed the SNP polling has gathered some momentum, and it was generally thought that he was going to be a very unpopular figure, and that, of course, has proved to be so. But the events of Tuesday have magnified that greatly, and I'll be very interested to know if Boris Johnson is still a factor at the next election, because I remain unconvinced that he can stay on.
I suppose you could argue that Her Majesty, after 66 years of her distinguished reign, has now been led into illegality by her Prime Minister. That is an unexpected train of events.
It is, and it's something of a world first. But let's remember that all this is happening against a backdrop of one of her previous prime ministers, David Cameron, having let slip that he lobbied Her Majesty the Queen to give some indication of her views on independence in the last Scottish independence referendum 5 years ago. So she's been dragged into politics not by one Prime Minister, a Conservative Prime Minister, but in fact by two, though, of course, Boris Johnson's behaviour is much the more egregious.
Yes, I think I may have had a bit part in that last story about
I think you did.
but
I think you rather did.
Isn't there an argument from some people that, in a way, this great court victory by Joanna Cherry rather contradicts the SNP argument? Doesn't that indicate that Scottish institutions, in this case the Court of Session, the Supreme Court of Scotland, is actually being respected by the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom? Perhaps Scotland should be a bit more comfortable in the United Kingdom.
Well, I don't take that from it at all. I mean, let's remember that the Supreme Court, of course, has judges on it, sitting on it from Scotland. There is an argument, I think, for there being a Supreme Court in Scotland without having any recourse to a Supreme Court in the UK, but that's something that we'll have to wait for a day if and when Scotland becomes an independent nation.
There was a distinction between the two judgments, of course. The Court of Session in our chamber said that the Prime Minister's motives were under suspicion, whereas the Supreme Court in the UK, the estimable Lady Hale, said it didn't really matter what the Prime Minister's motives were at all. Was that, did you get from that a difference in emphasis between the courts of Scotland and south of the border?
Well, I think there was a slight difference in that regard, but nevertheless, I mean, in some ways, the Supreme Court judgment of Tuesday was even more robust than anything that was said by the three judges at the Court of Session some time before, because she made it quite clear, Lady Hale, that not only was Johnson's action, not only were they unlawful, but in fact, Parliament wasn't prorogued at all, and please hurry back to work, folks. And that was, I think, a step further than even the Scottish Court went. So I think the other thing to bear in mind is that there was the High Court in London which said, as you rightly say, the High Court in London said it wasn't a matter for the courts. The Court of Session in Scotland and indeed Lady Hale in the Supreme Court of the UK begged to differ, and I think this is what has triggered, in anybody's language, a serious constitutional crisis.
So I'm now going to ask you to predict where now for Brexit and where now for the United Kingdom. We're moving into a tumultuous month with the deadline of Halloween looming. Where's Brexit going to be and where's Scotland going to be?
Well, to take these in the order that you've posed them, Alex, the situation in Westminster, as I understand it, is that the legislation that was passed by Parliament when it took control of the agenda in the UK, the legislation that was passed was specifically passed to outlaw any suggestion that the 31st of October deadline could stay in place if no deal had been made. In other words, no deal had to be off the table. I expect in the next few days and the next week or so that to harden up, and I expect Boris Johnson to be faced, if he's still there, to be faced with the prospect of either getting a deal that he can get through Parliament or going back for an extension or throwing in the towel.
Ruth Wishart, you're one of the most experienced journalists in Scotland. In your estimation, is there going to be a Brexit and is there going to be Scottish independence?
Well, I don't know whether there's going to be a Brexit. I really don't. I think probably the smart money now is on Boris pulling some kind of deal out of the hat, some kind of deal that will be dressed up to look different from Theresa May's deal, but will probably be much the same, with some fiddling around the Irish backstop. I think that's what might happen. He might get away with that. So far as independence is concerned, I happen to think that the stars have aligned here. You've got Brexit, which is very unpopular in Scotland. It voted 62% to remain. You've got Boris Johnson, who's very unpopular in Scotland, and you've got the polls, the gap in the polls between voting for yes and voting for no consistently narrowing. So, as you will tell, Alex, I'm not in the first flush of youth, but I would expect to be living in an independent country before I fall off my perch.
Ruth Wishart from Glasgow, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
In the drama of the last month, it's been easy to lose sight of an underlying trend. The Prime Minister has lost every battle, lost his parliamentary majority, lost in the Supreme Courts of Scotland and now the UK, but still leads in every opinion poll. Hence his previous anxiety for an early election. However, an election on his timing and on his terms no longer appears within his reach. And therefore, in order to cling to office, there seems little choice but to buckle down and try to resurrect Theresa May's once despised deal, with a few cosmetic changes to the Irish backstop. Even then, the Prime Minister's short-term survival cannot be assured with the Parliament he sought to prorogue now rampant. The only other options, asking for an extension to the Halloween deadline or resigning as Prime Minister forthwith, are even less palatable and, what's more, would test to the very limit his remaining poll strength. However, we are now moving through the conference season and into the month of the Brexit final denouement. Former UK Prime Minister Harold Wilson once said that a week was a long time in politics. In the Brexit drama, this coming month will be an eternity. Next week, we turn from the Houses of Parliament to those who have no house at all. Homelessness still stalks the land. We talk to some of the people in the capital city of London who are offering practical help. But for now, from Alex and me and all at the show, it's goodbye, and we hope to see you all next week.